Thank David for that very generous introduction. I want to tell you I'm especially moved and very grateful for this invitation. I'm very familiar with your shul. I know many people who daven here, and I feel like really I'm among friends and family. It's also a great pleasure to receive an invitation from David, somebody whom I know for many years. Can you hear me? I'm sorry. Is that better? I'm also unfortunately not a giant. David is somebody I know for many years and who has been of immense help to me in any number of situations. I consider him kind of like my therapist whenever I have questions pertaining to Yad Vashem, which I often do. And so I hope he hasn't put the meter on. I would also like to say, and I would be remiss were I not to mention, I'm especially moved to be here because of having learned the story of the great lady behind Shlomo Berlinger. I know Shlomo for about 20 some odd years, and I had no idea about his family story or the story of his wife. And I must tell you, this has made it all the more worthwhile to come here this evening. With respect to what I've been asked to speak about, which is the Jewish Military Union, or the JJV, I would like to explain a little bit about that organization, a little bit about what we know about it and what we don't know about it, and why this has become such a very complex issue, and why politics have entered into this and sort of further convoluted the story. Certainly with respect to the, whoops, there we go. Okay. I could hold the microphone if that's better. Can everyone hear me in the back? Okay. Certainly with respect to the Warsaw Ghetto, David is not mistaken. This is something that is probably one of the most iconic aspects of the Holocaust. It's often been compared to the struggle at Masada or Thermopylae. It's one of the best known episodes, and also it has become something that is a very important element of our identity, both as Jews and Israelis, and is very much rooted in the idea of Gvura. There certainly is no military encounter of similar scope or magnitude that has received the degree of attention that the Warsaw Ghetto has, and not just among scholars. For generations, it's sort of fired our imaginations, and it's in part due to the works of popular authors, and I say this whether for better or worse, such as Leon Uris, John Hershey, and many others. And it's also something that features very prominently in the curriculum in Israeli schools on the Holocaust. But I would venture to argue that the more we know about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and the more we know about the Warsaw Ghetto, we realize how much we don't know. And one might easily, at least in the non-scholarly community, think, well, what more is there to learn? We know so much, we have so many details, and there's such a huge number of publications and documentary films that have come out. I mean, one could easily think that's it. What is there to add? And as it turns out, there is a great deal that we don't know, and a good deal of what we do know, it turns out, is not really very accurate. And that's really at the bedrock of what my colleague and I have tried to do in our book. Certainly most of us, and even people who are not in the scholarly community, they recognize the name Mordechai Anilevich, they know who Antek Zuckerman is, and perhaps Tzvia Lubetkin. Almost everybody has heard of the Jewish Combat Organization and Mila 18. But it's important to realize that there's often a great gap between what we might call popular knowledge and fact, or popular perception. And so some of the things that we know about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising and the best known features, it turns out didn't quite happen the way we thought they did. And we're not even certain about some of the way some of the events actually happened. Certainly, far fewer people know about the other underground organization, which is the subject of my interest and of my presentation this evening, which is the Jewish Military Union, in Polish Żydowski Związek Wojskowy, or JZW. Just by a show of hands, I'd only be curious who in the audience has even heard of that organization. So we have a few people, but it's really a tiny minority. So were I to shoot out the name Pavel Frankel or Leon Rodal, I don't think very many people would know about them. And certainly the people that do know about them, I would venture to guess, and correct me if I'm mistaken, they know about them because of some publications that have appeared in recent years, most notably by Moshe Arens. But before that, there was not a great deal of popular knowledge about this. What I would like to do is to tell you, just in a nutshell, about this organization, how it came into being and what it did, and why this story was obscured, and how in recent years the story has been sort of deconstructed and reconstructed. This is a tall order in 20 minutes, but we'll do the best we can, and where there are gaps, I'd be very happy if we do have some time for Q&A to fill in. Well, let's begin with a few words about Polish Jewry, and this is very central to the creation of this other underground organization. It's very important to know that in the interwar period, Polish Jewry was highly politicized. You could have had in one family many different political loyalties, and often a great deal of animosity between people in the same family, simply because one would have gone in one political direction and the other in another. And often within the same household there could have been several brothers and sisters, and each of them would have gone in a different direction. Well, the group that I'm particularly interested in is the Zionist revisionist group. Many of you are familiar with that, the movement of Jabotinsky, Betar, which was certainly in interwar Poland one of the popular groupings. It was one of the options that people could have joined. It's also interesting that generally Jews who had a more traditional outlook often gravitated toward Betar because it wasn't really anti-religious, which many of the other youth movements were, because many of the other youth movements had a very ambivalent attitude toward religion in the best case, and in the worst case, a rather hostile one. Well, certainly with the German occupation of Poland and the establishment of the ghetto, about which we've heard a great deal this evening from a personal perspective, these organizations just basically moved into the ghetto and re-emerged. In the case of Betar, the re-emergence was a bit slower and a little bit less dynamic or less active than it was for the other organizations. And when I say the other organizations, let's say Hashomer, Hatzair, Drog, Poalei Zion, we could speak about the non-Zionist organizations, most notably the Bund, the socialist organization, or communists as well. So the Warsaw Ghetto was in fact a kind of hothouse of political ferment, despite the terrible conditions that existed there. And one of the reasons that Betar was a little bit slower to re-emerge and was a little bit less dynamic was it had lost most of its leadership. Most of the best-known people who were in Betar before the war, including most notably Menachem Begin, who was the kind of Nazi, the head of the organization, those people were no longer in Warsaw. With the outbreak of the war and the imminent fall of Warsaw to the Germans, those people picked up and moved. They evacuated with the rest of the population toward the east. So when the events that we're talking about took place, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, and at least in the period immediately before it, Begin and many of the others were no longer on the scene. And this is a question that's often discussed. Did they abandon a sinking ship? I wouldn't look at it that way. I mean, there was no reason for them to think they should go back. I mean, their emphasis was on Palestine and on Zionism, and so therefore they looked toward bringing people out and going toward the land of Israel. But nonetheless, even in the ghetto, some activity was resumed, and there were a few publications, and there were meetings, and so forth. And eventually, these coalesced into the beginnings of a underground organization. The question that's always asked: why didn't that underground organization join the existing underground organization, the one which operated on a much broader scale and under its umbrella included many different political groupings, some of which were actually hostile to one another? Well, that's an excellent question, and the answer is not completely clear, but it is clear that there was a great deal of animosity between the Zionist revisionists and the rest of the Jewish street, we could call it, and relations were very, very tense. It's a little bit too complicated to explain in the time I have allotted, but this just simply didn't happen. They didn't join forces. So you had this Jewish fighting organization, which included all the various Jewish youth movements, Zionist and non-Zionist, or even Zionist and anti-Zionist, and this group of Betarim, and a number of stragglers who were not necessarily Betarim, but for whatever reason didn't find their place in the other organization. What we do know about their actual role in the fighting: they played a very important role in the fighting on Moronovsky Square, which was one of the most important battles that took, if we can call them battle, I would say engagements, that took place in the Warsaw Ghetto. They were responsible, to the best of our knowledge, for the raising of the Polish flag and the Zionist flag, blue and white flag, which were raised over one of the tallest buildings in the ghetto. It was visible for many kilometers around and was something that was commented on in all the underground Polish press. And in the Stroop report, there's note of this. These are some of the things that were done. They fought in another sector, but eventually, like most of the other insurgents, they lost their lives. And some of them did succeed in getting to the Aryan side or survived after many ordeals in camps, but the great majority of them did not survive, and we know very little about what actually went on. It's impossible to construct a day-by-day or an hour-by-hour account of the actual military activity.